Welcome to the KE Cast, the official podcast of Korea Exposé. I'm your host, Bruce Harrison. Thank you so much for listening. Today at the Korea Exposé office in Seoul, South Korea, I'm speaking with the magazine's managing editor, Haeryun Kang, and CEO, Se-woong. We're talking about an unresolved mystery in South Korean contemporary art. It's a battle of a painter versus power. Haeryun starts us off.
So the story begins in 1992. No, was it 1991? Yes. Wait.
91, according to your
91.
article.
Okay. So the story begins in 1991 when an acquaintance of Chung Kyung-ja goes to a public bathhouse and sees a poster of a painting that's attributed to Chung Kyung-ja, the artist. So he calls her up and says, "Hey, there's a poster hanging in the bathhouse. Is this yours?" And Chung Kyung-ja says, "Let me take a look at it. I don't think it's mine." So she calls the museum and gets to see the original portrait and says, "This is not my painting. I would recognize it. This is too sloppy. I don't recognize the lines. This is too thin and superficial." And then the museum says it is hers. And I mean, and this kind of back and forth, the museum saying this is real, and Chung Kyung-ja saying this is not real. This has been going on since 1991 to today.
And what's interesting is that this museum it's not any museum, it is the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, the most prestigious institution in South Korea, as the repository of art from the most prominent artists in the country.
Hey, Jim, before we get into the mystery, tell us a little bit about this painting.
So the painting is small. It's about the size of a magazine. And it's a portrait of a woman with purple skin, staring deeply straight at the viewer, with flowers in her hair and black flowing hair, and with a butterfly on her shoulder.
My dreams right there. Okay.
I mean, personally, for me, like her Chung Kyung-ja's portrait series in the 70s and 80s aren't that appealing to me. They aren't particularly interesting. And among them, this alleged forgery is one of the least interesting. It's pretty bland. I saw it and I was like, meh.
Yeah, the painting has, even though it's perhaps a very mediocre painting, it has acquired this aura, right? Because of the scandal, because of all the intrigue, it has become famous, and perhaps it's a little bit like Kim Kardashian, maybe. It's a painting that's famous because of its fame, right?
It's the Kim Kardashian of paintings.
Yeah, it's a Kim Kardashian of Chung Kyung-ja's. So I think a lot of people go and see it in kind of awe. If I were to see it in person, I have not been there. I think I would certainly stand in awe because it's part of history.
Like Kim Kardashian's ass. Is that what you're saying? No.
I mean, that ass is going to go down in history.
It already has. It broke the internet, right? Or that was the goal. Okay, I see what you're saying now. Mm-hmm. Would you stand in awe of this portrait, Hayden?
You were there, actually.
The exhibition creates this aura. It magnifies it. You go, an entire huge corner of the museum is dedicated to this one portrait. It's behind glass, and orange lights are shining on it, and there's like newspapers highlighting different aspects of the scandal. I talked to a lot of people who were, coming to see the painting, and a guide was saying that a lot of people come to the museum just to see this small painting. And she was asking, "What do you guys think? What's your first impression?" A lot of them's like, "It's so small." That was the first reaction.
I mean, I wouldn't mind having it hanging in my living room, but
sure.
But also the question is it really a masterpiece? So you can really imagine, and if you are the artist, then if you actually had not painted it, you wouldn't be so happy to see this being the most famous work attributed to you.
Well, some years before her death, the artist Chung Kyung-ja spoke with Korean broadcaster KBS and flat out denied it's her painting.
엉성한 그림이에요.
She's saying it's a sloppy painting, and that's why she's screaming it's a fake. Okay, so back to the case with Ms. Chun. She's said it's not her painting. What happens?
Well, she gets embroiled in one of South Korea's biggest art scandals. So, after Chung Kyung-ja said that the painting was not real, the museum commissioned the Galleries Association of Korea, which is also a huge institution, network of artists and art experts in South Korea. And they had 7 authenticators to come in and prove if the painting was real or not. And their analysis proved that the painting was real. And Chung Kyung-ja refuted this analysis, saying that the Galleries Association was too closely tied with the government and the museum. So the process was probably corrupt and haphazard.
Okay, wow. So we have South Korea's most renowned authenticators telling the artist it's her painting, and she's still saying, no, it's not.
Right. And then rumors spread about the artist having dementia. She was in her 60s at the time, that she didn't know what she was saying. Her reputation was tarnished. Her close acquaintances shunned her and talked bad things about her. So she became really battered because of the scandal. And at one point, she said she didn't want to paint anymore. And she took back the statement almost immediately. But, eventually this whole scandal made her leave the country permanently. And she went to New York City, and that's where she eventually died a few years ago.
Poor and depressed, I imagine.
Probably very rich and depressed.
Not like Van Gogh.
No, but I mean, what's so interesting about the story is that it actually has not finished, even though the artist has passed away. We are now looking at another exhibition at the MMCA with Chung Kyung-ja's painting very prominently on display, with the museum creating an exhibition entirely designed to prove that they are right in claiming that this painting was indeed hers. And as recently as last year, we had the daughter of the artist once again refuting this claim and waging another legal fight. So it's still continuing, and this time we have new players coming into the picture.
So Chung Kyung-ja died several years ago, and when she died, this art forgery kind of came back into the spotlight, and the museum was saying that it's real. And so one of her daughters sued the museum for defamation. And that's how the prosecutors got in and started investigating on the whole thing.
They had to issue some kind of conclusion of their own, and to fight against these big government institutions, the artist's daughter brings in the French people.
And that's when the story gets really interesting for me, and perhaps for just, art lovers outside of Korea, because the French authenticators add another layer to this scandal that poses questions about the larger art world, not just about whether this painting is true or false.
Who are the French authenticators?
So there are a group of optical engineers at Lumiere Technology in Paris, and they have a really refined camera that can scan thousands of layers under a painting with like 13 different filters of light.
So they say this is the most advanced technology to authenticate portraits, right?
Well, in terms of scientific authentication.
Sure.
But scientific authentication is still seen as supplementary evidence. And in South Korea and the art world, which is still largely conservative, the human eye is way more important than the eye of the camera. So the Lumiere team basically said that the Chung Kyung-ja portrait statistically was probably fake. And the prosecutors and the museum discredited this claim, saying that, they don't have the traditional expertise and their analysis is flawed.
So it turns out the prosecution doesn't really want the help of the French, but the story gets weirder. Turns out Portrait of a Beauty was once in the collection of a very famous assassin.
So the museum apparently acquired the painting in 1980 from, and this is interesting, the assassin of a former president, Park Chung-hee. When Kim Jae-gyu was arrested after assassinating Park Chung-hee, the government confiscated all his possessions, and this somehow included this alleged forgery. And so that's how the MMCA came to acquire this painting.
Because the government had it, and the government is involved with the museum.
Exactly.
Okay.
And afterwards, the museum kept the painting in possession for about 10 years, and the artist had no knowledge of this. So they didn't actually confirm with the artist if this was real or not. They just kept it, and then 10 years later, they put it on a national exhibition spearheaded by the Minister of Culture. And that's how the artist found out that the museum even had this painting.
At the root of this, we have a famous artist saying, that's not my painting. We have the most famous museum in South Korea saying, oh, it's your painting. Why? Why is the museum throwing this on her and saying, oh, you're mistaken, this is your art?
It's about reputation, as many things tend to be about here in South Korea. But I think one thing that I want to mention is, aside from which authentication method is correct, what the most important thing in this scandal is the question of provenance, right? When you try to determine a painting is real, or any sculpture or anything like that, normally what experts try to do is to establish a clear chain from the origin, the source, to where the artwork is today.
And that trail is provenance.
That is called provenance. And in the case of 청경자, the provenance itself is flawed, right? We do not know whether the artist actually painted it. And then we do not know how the painting allegedly ended up in the Kim Jae-gyu, the assassin's collection. And it is even unclear whether the painting is really from Kim Jae-gyu, actually, right? That is what we're being told. So when you have these missing chains, a lot of artists, art experts that I know would say that it just makes it simply impossible to say with any kind of definitiveness that the work can be attributed to this particular artist. But for some reason, this is a question that is not really being addressed in the story that I have come across here in South Korea.
What do you guys think?
Well, I mean,
Based on the evidence in play.
based on the evidence in play, I think it's reasonable to conclude that it's fake. As we said earlier, we have the artist refuting the claim, we have the provenance, we have the anonymity of human authenticators that have declared the painting to be real, but their credibility is in line because we don't know who they are. And then all the ones who are willing to go on record are saying it is fake. So under the circumstance, how can anybody reasonably conclude that it's real? That's what I think.
Haeryun?
I think what made me really suspicious about the artwork more than anything else was actually the flowers. I was talking to Choi Kang-jin, the 청경자 expert, and he was walking through the process of why he thinks this painting is not real. And he was looking at the flowers in that painting and how sloppy it was compared to a lot of the other flowers in her other artworks. And I was just thinking, if 청경자 is the perfectionist that she's so famous for being, then how could she ever have painted these flowers?
I used to paint too. If I were to do, let's say, 2 portraits and they both have flowers, I'm not going to use the exact same shape flowers in both paintings. Do you know what I mean?
I think so, but I'm not a painter.
It's,
But you don't have to be a painter. You know, we're all journalists, and when we write an article or when we're reporting something or when you're producing this podcast, every detail is painstaking. Like, you know what you're producing inside and out because you go over it again and again. At least that's what it's like for me.
Well, I don't want you guys to put words in my mouth. I'm going to have a few beers and slap this thing together. But before we wrap up, I'm going to cut that out. No.
Ma, you should put that in.
Yeah, I will. Before we wrap up, I want to come back briefly to something Se-woong mentioned about the exhibit of Portrait of a Beauty is on display in Gwacheon until April 2018, if you want to check it out. Think the mystery will be solved by then?
nobody knows.
I guess nobody knows. That's why it's a mystery.
Dun, dun, dun.
Thanks to Haeryun and Se-woong for joining me on this week's episode, but we really just scratched the surface. If you want to learn more about this story, I highly recommend you check out Haeryun's feature called One of South Korea's Most Famous Paintings, But By Whom? Head to KoreaExposé.com to check it out. And if you enjoyed the show, subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. You can also catch updates on the podcast and the team's latest reports on Facebook and Twitter at Korea Exposé. I'm Bruce Harrison. Thanks for listening, and I hope you join us next week.